Orion is the all-new Giga coaster located at Kings Island in Mason, Ohio. It towers 287 feet in the air with a 300-foot drop. It is able to have that 13-foot difference between the height and drop because the coaster is situated over a ravine. It stretches along the backside of Racer, taking the spot of what used to be occupied by Firehawk and Dinosaurs Alive, and it is the new headlining attraction in Area 72. As of when this video is being made, I've managed to get a total of 10 rides in on the attraction, and I'm sure I'll get many more in the future, but I feel like I've gotten a pretty good feel for the ride as of now. So this is going to be my full in-depth review where I'm going to give you my thoughts on the ride and tell you whether it's worth or not to go out and check out this coaster. Now, the first thing I want to mention before I dive into the ride experience is how much of an impact this ride makes in the skyline. It is very imposing. You can see it from anywhere in the park. It towers over so many of the other attractions, and it just looks good. It's got a very pleasing color scheme. The blue track with the gray supports looks great, and even though the ride is new, it looks like it's been there for a while. And I don't mean to say that as in it's looking rusted or anything. It just fits naturally in the park. It'll make you forget all about the fact that there used to be a Vekoma Flying Dutchman in this spot. And I think when you actually enter Area 72, the whole re-theme as well as the coaster just makes you say, wow. They've absolutely transformed the area, added new buildings, theming, and even a soundtrack. They had IMAscore do an entire theme for Orion, and it is blasting in Area 72 the whole time, and it really sets the mood. So let's talk about what happens when you enter this queue. The actual entrance for Orion is repurposed from the Firehawk photo booth, and unlike many of the other new Cedar Fair attractions, Orion doesn't have a big, huge entrance sign like Fury or Copperhead Strike, Banshee. Instead, Orion has an entire building. Is it as visually impressive? Well, maybe not, but I think it works because the whole theme of Orion is set up as this government outpost while they're trying to deduce what these meteors are all about and what's going on here. So you see a satellite on top of the building, there's a radio tower to your right, and that's just the beginning. I was really impressed with how Cedar Fair stepped it up to theme this attraction. Is it as good as the theming in Europe? Well, no, but for Cedar Fair, this is pretty dang good. I think you could definitely make an argument that this is the best themed ride in the park, and if it's not the best themed ride in the park, then it's Flight of Fear, the ride located directly next to it. And what's cool is that they actually have the themes feeding off of each other. There are lots of references in Orion's queue, and if you want to know what all of those references are all about, check out my other video where I talk about the Easter eggs located in Area 72 and Orion's queue line. But let's jump into the ride experience. You're going to board your 32 passenger vehicles, 4 across seating, B&M clamshell restraints, and they do have a seat belt. Something interesting about the seat belt though is that it is retractable. What that means is it'll tighten on your body, and when you pull on it, it won't release. However, during the ride experience, let's say you get a sharp moment of airtime, the seatbelt will give a notch, and so your body will kind of move up with the seatbelt. It's very strange, and I can't decide if I like it or not, because let's say if it were a normal seatbelt and it'd fit your form, but then you could pull at it to make it a little looser, then it wouldn't really affect how much airtime you get. But here, initially, the seatbelt will prevent you from coming up out of your seat, but then if those forces are strong enough, the seatbelt will release a little so that you do pop up a little. It's very bizarre. Obviously, I think it would have been better if they had just not had the seatbelt at all. Because B&M has a flawless track record, we know that they can just have clamshells and it'd be fine. But it's Cedar Fair, gotta add seatbelts. So it is what it is. You depart out of the station and start ascending up that massive lift hill. And when I say massive, I mean it is massive. If you've ridden Leviathan or Fury 325, this looks the exact same. And I'd say it even feels the same when you go down the first drop. Leviathan and Fury have identical feeling drops, and this one is no different. The only main difference that I would say Orion has in the lift structure is that this chain lift is very quiet. You know that click-clack you hear from the chain dog hitting the anti-rollbacks over and over again? You don't really hear that on Orion. It is silent, which is a nice contrast from some of those RMCs like Steel Vengeance and Twisted Timbers that are extremely loud. So you crest over, and unlike some of the other Gigas, this one slows down at the top, so you don't full send over the drop. You're going up the lift hill at a pretty good speed, and then it slows you down. So if you're in the front row, you start to creep over, and then it releases you. And naturally, this is a first drop that is much preferred in the back seat because you feel that pull. You feel like you're falling for a really long time. But I would not say that the drop feels any different than Leviathan or Fury's. If you've experienced those drops, you've essentially experienced Orion's first drop. But that's pretty much where the similarities end. Orion's layout is very different from Fury Furies and Leviathans. While Fury and Leviathan go straight into a right-hand turn, Orion instead goes into a wave turn. And this was my most anticipated element on the coaster simply because I didn't know how it was going to feel. We haven't really seen something like this on a B&M, especially not something this huge. And I gotta say, I think this element underwhelmed me just a bit. I was expecting some serious sustained airtime as you're hanging over the side, but you don't really get that. You might get a little, particularly if you're in the front, but it's not as much as I think I was hoping. So that was the first moment of Orion that kinda underwhelmed me. Am I glad it's there? I mean, yeah, it's still very cool, it's unique, it's different, but I almost wish you stalled at the top just a little bit longer, which isn't really the case. But following that, we have a higher up turnaround. This is the furthest point of the layout before you start heading back. And frankly, there's not a whole lot to say about this turn. It's fine. I think it's one of the most underwhelming moments of the coaster. Frankly, it doesn't really do a whole lot. I don't know anyone who got off Orion and said, man, that turnaround was awesome. The moment following that is pretty cool though. We have a speed hill. And for a lot of people, this is their favorite part of Orion. It's not my favorite. I'd say it's my second favorite moment. You absolutely come up out of your seat, and not just for a quick second, it is sustained. If you've ridden Mako or Shambhala, both of those coasters have speed hills, and they're great moments, and Orion's has too. That hill did not disappoint. The hill following that is a lot larger, and this is a pretty standard B&M airtime hill. You can experience this on another ride in the park, Diamondback, and it feels about the same. If there is a downside to it, as you're rising up before you hit the peak, there is a trim. You don't notice it as much in the front as you do in the back. It's one of the reasons I actually prefer this coaster in the front, but I'm going to talk about that a little later. The biggest reason why I'm not a huge fan of this trim is because without it, I believe the Helix would be taking a lot faster speed, which is, of course, as a coaster enthusiast, something that we would love. The public, maybe not so much, so I understand why it's there. It's not necessarily a huge deal. As I mentioned, in the front row, you don't feel it a whole lot. From here, though, this is where Orion does something different. Typically, coasters throw in a helix at the end of the ride right before you hit the brake run. Orion has a twisted helix that it goes through, which has been nicknamed Orion's Belt, and this is easily the most intense part of the coaster. Most of my rides on Orion, I did gray out at this moment. When the train was running a little slower, I did not, but especially middle of the day, when it's hot out, coasters running fast, yeah, you'll gray out here. The gray out starts once you've risen from ground level, turning to the right, and then it ends right when you go back to ground level. Your vision clears up, you twist in between a support and the bottom of the first drop. Very cool near miss. And from here, you have one more element before you hit the brake run, and this element happens to be my favorite moment of the coaster. This was a big surprise for me. I did not really expect much from this hill at all, but man, did it deliver. This sideways banked airtime hill at the end of Orion is a fantastic moment. I wouldn't call it ejector, but it's close. It's very strong floater. When you hit the peak of that twisted hill, you shoot up out of your seat. Remember how I was talking about how the seatbelt would retract and have a little give to it? Especially with that moment in particular, the seatbelt will release a little, and yeah, you'll come up out of your seat a bit more. And to top it all off, you have one last moment of airtime as you rise into the brake run. And that concludes your ride experience. In short, Orion is, well, short. I think when the ride was announced, a lot of people were underwhelmed at the length, and I'll clump myself in as one of those people. The ride does not feel super long, which is interesting because it actually has over 5,000 feet of track. It just so happens that you're going 91 miles an hour, so you blaze through the layout. I know I would have liked to have seen a few extra elements. From a marketing standpoint and a financial standpoint, I can see why it wouldn't have made a whole lot of sense to add them there. I think the biggest reason why I'm sad about it is because they just have so much land back there that they definitely could have fit in some more track. They had the room for it and they just chose not to. But the fact of the matter is, you have to look at what Orion does instead of what it doesn't do. And I fell into this trap right after I got off of it. If you watched the video where Alec and I talked about our thoughts on the coaster after our first ride, you saw we were not very impressed. And I found that we were not the only ones who did that. I've talked to lots of people who've ridden Orion, and their first rides, they were very disappointed. It wasn't until their third, fourth, or fifth rides on Orion where they started to like it. I knew a guy after he rode it, it was one of his least favorite rides in the park. After getting several rides on it, now it's his second favorite. And you know, I think I might clump myself in that group. Orion's not my favorite coaster in the park. Is it my second or third favorite? You know, I'd say it probably is. but I still stand by my statement that I said in that video where I was underwhelmed by the actual ride experience. Is Orion my least favorite Giga coaster? You know, now that I've done all of them, I don't think it is. Of the 7, I definitely put it in the lower half, but is it the best themed Giga coaster? You betcha. I said it from the beginning with my official analysis of Orion when it was announced, I wish the coaster stayed more low to the ground. That was one of the best parts of Fury. And when you have a ride like Diamondback that is all up and downs, it's a shame that Orion didn't spend more time closer to the ground, especially since this is a terrain coaster. The ride is situated on a hill, but guess what? You would never know it. That's, I think, what bothers me most about Orion. It's not the fact that, oh, well, they skimped out on the height. It's only 287 feet instead of 300 feet. I don't care. The drop feels the exact same as Leviathan and Furies. I don't think we would have noticed an extra 13 feet. So that doesn't bother me. I just think they could have done a bit more with the layout. That being said, if you are going out to Orion, let's talk about where you should ride. And I went back and forth on this. For a bit, I was saying, you know, I think back row is where it's at. But after a couple recent rides, I have changed my mind and I think this is a front row coaster. The only element that is better in the back is the drop, which is interesting because I am typically a back row rider, and don't get me wrong, I'll still ride Orion in the back and like it, but if you want my suggestion of where to ride, I say do it in the front, especially if you're riding it later in the day. Plus, there's just something about riding a Giga coaster in the front where you have that wind screeching in your ears. It just works. Now, the last thing I want to talk about before I give my final score is the smoothness. This is a new for 2020 B&M, so it should be glass smooth, right? Wrong. Orion jitters. I wouldn't really call it a rattle, but as you go through the layout, it has this vibration to it that'll kind of shake as it goes around the layout. And I thought this was super weird. You ride a ride like Mako that's been around since 2016, that thing is still as smooth as can be. Griffin, Busch Gardens Williamsburg, glass smooth, that opened in 2007. So what's going on here? I heard someone mention that it might be the ground that Kings Island sits on. The soil might not be as strong as others, which is why the B&Ms at Kings Island all feature the same characteristic. Diamondback has a rattle. Banshee is just flat out rough. If you have ground that isn't as strong as it could be, then it might cause the supports or the track to move in ways that it shouldn't, and that's what might be causing the rattle. I don't know that for a fact. I'm not a mechanical engineer, but that was the explanation that made sense to me, because I couldn't figure out why Kings Island's B&Ms are like this, but other B&Ms are not. I know that this might not necessarily bother everyone, but that was one of the things that very much surprised me after riding it for the first time, as I was like, wow, that was not as smooth as it should be. So all that being said, for Orion's final score, I am giving it an 8 out of 10. What does Orion do well? The theming, the first drop, the speed hill, and of course that last airtime hill before the brake run. Everything else though, I think is fine. As a whole, the ride does leave a little bit left to be desired. If you ride it for the first time and are underwhelmed, I encourage you to ride it a couple more times so you can appreciate what the ride does do. I don't think Orion ranks very highly for me at all. I don't think it's in my top 25. Might not even be in my top 35 or 40, I don't know, but the ride looks great in Kings Island skyline. It's sure to be a crowd pleaser. I think the public is really gonna enjoy it. And is it an improvement over Firehawk? Oh yeah, totally. So if you get the chance to come out to Kings Island, I'd say be sure to get a ride in on Orion. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. If you have ridden it, be sure to post down below. If you agree with what I have said, or if you think I'm totally wrong, you can let me know why down below. And of course, make sure to stay tuned for more coaster reviews here at Coaster Studios, and I'll see you next time.